Welcome to Hickory Street Podcast. We're doing another episode. This time it's a book review again. And I'm really excited to do this one because it's a part of history that I'm very interested in and enthusiastic about to some degree because um, there's been so much that I've been able to uncover since I've been out of college. And initially, this was a period of history that I honestly didn't have much interest in. I had one professor that specialized in this field, and I thought it was really interesting because he wasn't an American citizen to begin with. He immigrated here from Israel, funny enough, but ended up focusing on this very particular era of American history that he was able to kind of mention some things about in the class that I was taking. But at the time, he was actually teaching a class on Roman history. It was Roman military history, so it wasn't even related to what his specialized field was. But he explained in the class that he had actually been studying Roman history as a part of his book that he was putting together, drawing parallels between American history and Roman history. So, and the field of study that he focused in was early colonial American history, and I think the time period was like 1500 to the Declaration of Independence, and and then the American Revolution. I think he studied the. Oh yeah, that's right. He also said he focused in the um the military movements and the military history of the American Revolution. So, very interesting class that I took, and he's still probably one of my favorite professors from whenever I was in college. So, here's the book. If you don't follow the Instagram page, it's called "The True History of the American Revolution." It's by George Sidney Fisher, and just a little bit about the author in particular. He is one of the first American historians. His father and he himself was from Pennsylvania, and I don't know much about him specifically, but this book was initially published in 1902, and uh, around the essentially near the end of the first industrial revolution. I would say, if you wanted to count like the second industrial revolution, it was probably the creation of um, textile factories. So this was sort of at the age when the textile industry was in its infancy, essentially. So, people worked in the textile industry, but it wasn't necessarily as um, hyper productive as it became uh, in the 1920s, whenever we ended up having all of these labor laws prohibiting child labor and stuff like that. So this was before a lot of the issues involved with the Industrial Revolution happened, but I would say it was probably near the tail end of the first Industrial Revolution, and so, anyways, this book, just to kind of give you my the value that I've extracted from it is that it explains all of the contextual things surrounding the American Revolution that we aren't necessarily taught in school. And it actually breaks down in the first section of the book the military movements that don't necessarily make sense from a strategic standpoint, and puts into context how a lot of these situational aspects of the relationship between the colonists and the British crown were creating an environment in which those peculiar military movements actually do make sense. So I'm going to start with the governmental structure that exists whenever the American Revolution, long before the American Revolution breaks out. So there's I'm gonna ignore essentially a certain portion of the beginning of the book, just because it's not necessarily relevant to what I think the entire book is about. I think it just kind of sets the stage. So it just talks a lot about demographics and how fast the colonies grow, and I don't think that's necessarily relevant to what the meaning of the book is at the moment. So the governmental structure that the British colonies had was a structure that the King George of Great Britain developed as a result of the colonies growing in population so quickly, because they did grow very quickly. And it's a very complicated and convoluted system, and there's a lot of regional exceptions to the way that this operated. So I'm going to outline how it actually functioned, and then I'll kind of elaborate more on what some of the exceptions were and how maybe some of these colonies were able to operate in a way in which they could become exceptions to how things were supposed to function. So the way that the colonies operated from a governmental standpoint was that the colonies, about 200 years before the Declaration of Independence, initially operated on just a communal basis. So there wasn't a formal government established. There was a mayor, perhaps, of the town that was really just kind of a respected individual, and most, disagreements or disputes were handled amongst the colonists themselves. But then eventually, because the population grew, the crown adopted a new governmental structure through Parliament that essentially established a colonial legislature, of the most respected individuals in the community, in the colony, and they were elected by popular vote of the colonists themselves, and there wasn't really a number associated with the population, so it was really just kind of whoever the colonists wanted to represent them. And the colonists, through this legislature, were represented to the crown, and then the crown had a governor that would represent Great Britain and would transfer messages directly from the crown to the colonists through the legislature. Now, the legislature didn't necessarily pass any kind of laws or policies. They were mainly operating in a way that was settling disputes, either between colonists themselves or disputes that the crown felt were necessary to address. So. And this is how most of the colonists operated, with the exception of Boston, Massachusetts, and a few other colonies, particularly in like Philadelphia and New York. It was a little bit more. It was a little bit more unconventional, but specifically Boston was not subject to this form of government for the longest period of time, and the author kind of alludes to a potential reason why that might have been, and one of the reasons why is because Boston was a port city, and Great Britain essentially controlled a lot of the channels in which goods were sent to America through this port, and so there was a large loyalist population that the majority of them just kind of followed, whatever policies that Great Britain, wanted to impose collectively for the most part. There was a local elected, body, and there eventually was a British governor that was put in place there, but for the majority of the 200 years before the American Revolution, Great Britain had absolutely no presence in Boston, and like I said, in Philadelphia and in New York, it was a lot of this, believe it or not, some of the southern colonies that had more of this legislative body that existed, and it existed and he kind of alludes to this as well in his explanation, but perhaps because of the manufacturing of goods that specifically tobacco in the South, and so Great Britain wanted more control over the production aspect of it and the exportation of goods outside of the colonies, so that they could maintain a stream of revenue from the production of the colonies. So the way in which this dynamic interacted with each other was actually, it was written down. It was how it was supposed to be operating, and the way it operated was the governor would get messages from the crown, from Parliament, instituting certain policies that the colonies were supposed to follow, and the legislature had the authority to vote on whether or not they wanted to go along with the policy. So they had the option of voting against it. But if they voted against it, They had to essentially draft a letter outlining reasons why it might not be functional. And you can understand why this might actually be beneficial for Great Britain, because being that they were so far away and disconnected from how the colonies operated, it's very possible that they would institute some kind of policy that would not necessarily function very well in the society, and that, the society itself couldn't see as being tenable or resolving a certain issue they were trying to resolve. So that's sort of how things started to be. That's sort of how things started to operate around 1650. And the dilemma, and this was written into the policy of government through the crown, was that if the colonists disagreed with a policy that the crown wanted to institute, and they voted on it and they shut it down, they had the authority to withhold the salary of the governor that represented Great Britain. And this is the most contentious issue that led to the breaking down of this system. And you start to understand why through his explanation, which outlines that there was rising political tensions within Great Britain, between two factions of political thought, which is the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories being the conservative party of the British government, and the Whigs being the liberal party of the British government. And there's also a lot of economic reasons why the governor's salary was dependent on the agreement of the legislative body of the colonies. And the reason why was because Great Britain did not think it was tenable or necessarily realistic to provide funds for the salary of the governor directly from England itself, because the colonies were producing. They started to they started to be able to export major crops, being tobacco and other goods that Europe wanted, and Great Britain sought out to take advantage of the production of the colonies. But this form of government did not really become solidified until about, like I said, 1650. So you have almost 100 years where the colonies were completely self-sufficient. The people that immigrated from Europe, from Great Britain, that ended up in America, they fended for themselves, essentially. They, made all their own clothes. They lived on their own land. They grew their own food. They, produced their own goods to trade and sell. And it was a self-sustaining system for a very long time, and there was no reason necessarily for Great Britain to get involved until about 1650, whenever the population had grown so much and the production aspect started to become economically realized. So the next phase of the rising tensions is by early 1700s, there became how do I say this? It was recognized that there were a lot of issues that Great Britain was going to encounter with pirating and smuggling tactics by a lot of these port cities that they could not control. So Great Britain instituted a law prohibiting any trade with any foreign government without the involvement or the acknowledgement of Great Britain. So the colonies were prohibited from trading with Holland, the Dutch, as a result. But there were merchants that lived in these coastal cities that essentially just ignored this law and continued to operate. Now, this is where the demographic of the Patriots start to develop, because through these acts of smuggling, what you end up having is in these port cities, you have a select group of merchants that benefit from smuggling that are bypassing the taxation law that already existed. This already existed by then, but they continued to ignore the taxation laws of Great Britain regarding any imports to the colonies from a foreign country. So the colonies, these merchants were able to essentially reap 100% of the profits from their trading with these foreign countries. And they did it in private, going around the British government. And this became an issue when the French and Indian War happened. And this is really where the conflict begins to spiral out of control. Starting, and I'm just kind of guesstimating some of these dates here because I didn't write any of this down. I'm just speaking off of memory. I want to say it was around 1750, 1760 time frame, about 10, 15 years before the Declaration of Independence. And so through this new emerging merchant class that was able to build their wealth through these acts of smuggling and retaliating through these acts of going around the British government. Whenever the French and Indian War ended, Great Britain now had a military obligation to the colonists, because through the migration and disbursement of these Native American warriors and these Native American tribes, most of which were migrating from Canada, getting closer and closer to the borders of the colonies. What ended up happening is Native Americans began to raid the colonies, and there's several instances in which Native Americans would go into a colony and massacre upwards of 1,000, sometimes more, colonists, just everyday average citizens. And in some cases, burning down houses, burning down farmland. And Great Britain encountered a multitude of issues as a result of the end of the French and Indian War. One of which being that they could not pay these soldiers the pay that they were promised for participating in the French and Indian War. And the second issue was that, and it was more of a logistical issue, is that since they couldn't even pay the salaries, migrating them out of the colonies became increasingly difficult. And so whenever the Native Americans began to raid the colonies on a consistent basis at the end of the French and Indian War, Great Britain was forced to essentially tell the majority of the soldiers who participated in the war to stay in the colonies and protect the colonies from being raided by the Native Americans. Now, as you can understand, the military of the British colony, of the British Crown, was not happy about this. They, a lot of them were writing letters consistently to try and get payment for their service, and were continually being run around. That I think the book also kind of mentions that that Great Britain tried to develop an agreement with the colonies for payment and tried to find a way to maybe pay them in land or other means, and it became a real issue that Great Britain couldn't rectify, and it caused a lot of political tension in Parliament between the Whigs and the Tories, because now the Tories essentially transitioned from being adamant about not getting involved in the French and Indian War to now being very practical in supporting the protection of the colonies. And this slowly began to infringe upon the beliefs of the Whigs, which, before the French and Indian War, supported the French Revolution, and after the French and Indian War, supported the French Revolution, and essentially adopted a lot of the philosophies of the time through the Enlightenment period in the 1600s that encouraged self-governance and economic autonomy separated from government, and things of that nature. And so during this time period, there's the aristocratic class of colonists in America at the time began to read a lot of these French philosophers that were calling for changes within the French government that encouraged the French Revolution. And so a small group of this aristocratic and merchant class clung on to these ideas very hard. And so by the time we had the Stamp Act and the Glass Act and the taxation policies that Great Britain was now trying to enforce, and this other issue of British soldiers occupying the colonies through their duty to protect them, we had a breakdown of this governmental system that had been in place. And we had and this had never happened before, but we had this governmental system that was in place that didn't exist in any of the other British colonies, because it was just in the colonies in America, that now gave so much power to the colonists themselves that it became sort of a intellectual pissing match, essentially. You see around this time a lot of letters from these legislative bodies to the crown outlining, more and more grievances of the policies that were trying to be passed down to the colonies themselves, and a lot of radical ideas that were being communicated back to the crown. And so with the compounding of these issues, the Whigs became increasingly more on the intellectual side of the colonies, and the Tories became more and more on the intellectual side of the crown, that wanted to uphold a certain standard for their colonies. Now, here's where I think it's important to probably talk about the demographic aspect of the American population at this point. So we don't have necessarily the word patriot being used during this time period in the 40s and the 1740s and the 1750s yet. It's things are changing, but we don't have a name for the colonists that aren't going along with the policies of the crown, essentially. So a lot of colonists, the majority of colonists, still consider themselves British citizens. It was in the in the author gives some specific numbers, and I don't remember them specifically off the top of my head, but I want to put it into percentages so that you can kind of, like, estimated percentages, so that you can kind of gather some indication of what the political climate looked like in the colonies at the time. But the demographic that consider themselves loyalists in the colonies represented probably close to 90 to 85% of the colonists. And it was really only about 10 to 15 or 20% at its highest number that considered themselves to be patriots at some point. Now, during this period before the word patriot started to be used, there were a series of debates that were famous for a long time in Parliament between, the Whigs and the Tories. And there were a lot of arguments that started to be made by the colonists through the legislative body that were put into writing to the king, and it cited a lot of philosophers like Adam Smith, most notable. I could try to name a few other ones that are mentioned in the book. It's a lot of French names, and I don't think most people would recognize them, so I'm not going to really get into that a whole lot. But Adam Smith being the big one. And the colonists presented an argument to the crown that spurred this huge debate in Great Britain between the Whigs and the Tories. And so I'm going to outline the argument that the colonists were making, and then I'm going to explain the results of the debates. So the colonists made a claim that they were not a colony, that they considered themselves to be a classification called um, an electorate protectorate province, essentially. So their claim is that Great Britain had a duty to protect them, but they were autonomous in governing themselves. Now, this book breaks down all of the very individual policies and laws that Parliament passed that made this claim completely unfactual. It had no legal basis for legitimacy. So they were using another English province as an example in their arguments. I can't remember the name at the moment, but essentially, the Crown wrote, I can't remember the representative's name, but they wrote a letter back to the colonies outlining how all of these legal things that have been in existence for, at this point, close to 100 years, dating back to 1650s, 1630 time period, made their claim legally incorrect, and that they 100% were a colony under the British Crown. And one of the most contentious issues, and this is where I think a lot of the context is lost on people that might have been introduced to this through school at a young age, like myself. But one of the claims was that they did not have any representation in Parliament, and so that classified them as not being a colony and rather a province under a magistrative protectorate. And that was factually incorrect due to the way that it was structured, because the governors that were appointed to the colonies by the Crown gave them a vehicle for representation. It gave them representation in Parliament, because there were representatives in Parliament that would take the grievances that were expressed to these, appointed governors into consideration whenever they would send letters back to Great Britain. So that was proven to be false, among a lot of other claims that would be really difficult for me to get into right now. But so once that was debunked through these letters, a huge debate happened in Parliament over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks, and there were lots of articles that were written about it, that and lots of letters that were written, back to the colonies, letting them know exactly what was going on. And their arguments through these debates in Parliament were proven to be, false from a legal standpoint, and the Whig Party lost these debates definitively. They were annihilated, essentially, through these debates. So now we have an issue where the colonies are no longer able to get their dreams of autonomy realized through any legitimate means of the colonies, or of Parliament and the British Crown. So what ends up happening is Great Britain, for the first time, tries to control Boston. They send their troops into Boston, which is the most radicalized territory in the colonies. And this is where you start to see military presence throughout the streets of Boston. And this is leading up to about 6 years before the Declaration of Independence. So we're talking about 1770s now. And the British government sends ships and fleets to put an end to the smuggling practices of these merchants that live in Boston. And, through this new military occupation and the appointment of a governor in Boston that was directly representative of the Crown's wishes, tensions start to rise amongst this, like I said, very small group of colonists, only about 20%, 15% of them. And this is where we're going to get into some of the psychology of these tensions now, because I think this is where we need to kind of get the importance of these changes of government. So I'm going to turn on this light real quick. Okay, so here's what I want to outline first. So if you're a colonist in Boston and you have, you've had your father, your grandfather, and your great-grandfather, all migrate to America and build themselves up as a merchant, or a subsistence farmer, or get into some kind of trade business, and you're now starting to realize your own wealth, and the British government hasn't had a hand in it in 100 years, really, and you've been in this region pretty much your whole life, and your descendants have been in this region their whole life, and now all of a sudden, after the French and Indian War, Great Britain is trying to collect taxes from you to pay soldiers, and these soldiers are now being lined in the streets that you live in and being put into your home, and you're now having to fulfill an obligation of feeding and letting these soldiers live amongst you whenever you've had a wife and kids for years, and now this random soldier is legally allowed to just live with you. It becomes a very confusing thing for you psychologically if you adopt a lot of these new radical philosophies that we're talking about. And this is the psychology of the modern patriot in the colonies. Now, like I said, most of the colonists were loyalists. So, this was a minority, not a majority of the thought process and the psychology that existed. So then I'm going to skip through a lot of the parts that everybody kind of knows. Because, we know about the Boston Tea Party. We know about the Boston Massacre. And, everything that we just talked about is what leads up to this. So, the Declaration of Independence was adopted just a couple of months after the colonists sent essentially a final letter to Great Britain outlining what they wanted. And whenever they didn't get what they wanted, the Continental Congress decided to draft the Declaration of Independence, and that's how the American Revolution starts. So, to summarize this portion, the American Revolution started not because the majority of colonists just wanted individual freedom and autonomy. That's not exactly what happened. This was a civil war that started to develop in Great Britain. And the colonies became the chosen example by Great Britain to change the growing sentiment against the king, to reestablish authority over radical ideas that the Whigs within British society had began to adopt. So that is the story of how the American Revolution starts. Now, this is very interesting because now I'm going to get into the psychology of Great Britain, which is not as easily outlined. And there's a lot of inferring that people have to do. And I'm going to kind of give my take because the author presents all of the factual information that leads to a conclusion that he doesn't necessarily outright acknowledge because the British themselves never really said that. But in a peculiar move at the beginning of the American Revolution, the British government assigns William Howe to be the leading general of the British Army in the American Revolution. Now, William Howe is from a certain province. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. I want to say it's York. I think he was related somehow to the Duke of York. I think he was like the brother of the Duke of York or something like that. And he is very outwardly a Whig, which is a very peculiar choice given that the British government had been posturing that they didn't agree with any of the Patriot sentiments. And so there's a couple of reasons I think that this happened. One, I think it's because Great Britain did not want a true... They did not want to truly impose their will on the colonies. I think they wanted the colonists to feel like they could be part of British society still. And the majority, like I said, the majority of the colonists were loyalists. Now, I have to mention this as far as a demographic standpoint goes. So, whenever the American Revolution breaks out, you have close to about 40 to 30% of the loyalists that live in the colonies migrate back to Great Britain. So a very large portion of Great Britain's colonists goes back to Great Britain because they're loyal to the king and they don't agree with the revolution, and now the revolution is just happening and they don't feel safe. So that happens. And during this period, as a lot of the loyalists are leaving, one of the reasons why they leave is because the Patriots become murderous. They 100% start to do things that make the loyalists fear for their lives. There's stories of loyalists having the head of the household, the man of the household, being dragged outside of his home into the streets by the Patriots and beaten to death, or beaten or shot to death, and or in some cases just being stripped of their clothes and being tarred and feathered. There was even a case of a loyalist that was literally dragged through the streets of Boston with a rope tied around his neck by a horse, and just brutal things. And the loyalists started writing letters to each other in code to try to disclose the fact that they were a loyalist because of the radicalness of this. So a very small minority of patriots existed at first, or actually throughout the entire war. It was always a minority, and they were very well known as a murderous and violent group. So, I think that William Howe was appointed as the head of the British Army as a way to try and alleviate some of the tensions, to get some of the violence settled without conflict between British soldiers, and hopefully try to get them to sort it out amongst themselves. And that's why throughout the entire American Revolution, there's a lot of military events that don't make any sense. And the psychology that I think that Great Britain has is that they saw the colonists as British citizens. They did not see them as true enemies and adversaries. They saw them as, being disgruntled and, maybe just confused. That they didn't really see them as, they didn't see their concerns as being that big of a deal, or necessarily that important from the grand scheme of the country, because they were such a small group. And the British Army was literally the biggest army, the biggest navy in the world at that point. So throughout the first 5 or 6 years of the war, it wasn't really up until the last maybe year or the last couple months of the war, you have these situations where William Howe will just take over a city before the winter comes and stay in that city the whole year and never go on the offensive and try to attack George Washington's army. And just to kind of put it into perspective, the British Army outnumbered the American Army 3, sometimes 4 to 1. And at the strongest of Great Britain's, at the strongest of George Washington's army, it was only about 10,000 troops strong. And that really only happened a very short period of time, because George Washington had an issue of a lot of the Patriot Army becoming loyalists and just leaving the army and just going back to Great Britain. And so there's so many instances in which the American army is literally just within like a mile or two of the Patriot Army, sometimes just over some kind of natural obstacle or something. And British Army never attacks them. And it's because William Howe, one, agreed with them in a lot of ways, but two, since the majority of the colonists were, British citizens, it was almost kind of a bad publicity stunt to just go and annihilate George Washington's army outright. But the logistical issues and the expenses that Great Britain has started to accrue over, trying to be involved in this war for, 5 or 6 years at this point, they became increasingly dissatisfied and wanted an end to the war. And so the belief by the Tories and the rest of British society was that this has to end now. We can't just keep going back and forth with the colonists and the Patriot Army. We have all of these resources. We could have annihilated them for so long, but we appointed this Whig to try to smooth things over with the colonists as the leader of the British Army, and he's not doing his job. And William Howe kept citing a certain area of his decree of how he was supposed to operate the war whenever they would send these letters being mad at him. And eventually he was forced to resign. And a couple of other elements I want to mention is that William Howe actually fell in love while he was here, and so he got married and just essentially stayed with his wife the whole time he was here, whenever he was occupying Boston and New York and Philadelphia for months on end during the war. So it was a lazy war in a lot of ways, because they didn't really want to annihilate the Patriots until it had just gone on so long, and the British government had spent so much money that they just wanted it to be over. So that's whenever Henry Clinton is appointed, and William Howe was forced to resign. And there's a lot of, it goes into all of the specific battles and military movements, but I just don't have time to get into all that. So, George Washington's army is struggling, and whenever Henry Clinton is appointed, we had been pleading to the French government to get involved throughout the entirety of the war. The French government didn't see as being serious, or even didn't have many issues with Great Britain at all. But then whenever the French Revolution happened and a new form of government and political thought took over in France, and with the success of the one battle that the Americans definitively won, which was the Battle of Saratoga, France gets involved in the war. And here's something that's not as well known, I think, about this part of the war, which is that Spain had started to develop some territorial issues with Great Britain and their colonies, as well as some economic issues that they were experiencing, because Great Britain started to increase their taxes to try and get more revenue because they were broke from this war. And, there was even a famine at one point in England that just completely destroyed their economy. And so at this point, you have a huge underlying civil unrest issue happening in England, and it's being bled into other European countries through their relationship with these countries. And Spain enters the war, and then the Dutch enter the war. And the Dutch entered the war due to their ships and their illegal trade with the American colonies starting to be disrupted by the British by the British fleet, and disrupted by the war due to them, also accruing a lot of these taxes that the British Crown was now starting to try to levy on a lot of their trade relationships, as England is in a economic spiral downward and social spiral downward, and there's no consensus amongst them anymore. So without getting into some of the military movements, although it is interesting, I just want to tell the story, really, of how the war actually ended. But Spain, France, and Holland enter the war, and Washington makes a strategical military movement to, instead of attack Henry Clinton's army in Philadelphia, which was the expected move, he instead attacks a fortification, an occupation of the British government in North Carolina. He was expected to cross the Hudson River and try to fight Henry Clinton's armies in New York and in Philadelphia, and he didn't do that, and he went and took over the other part of Henry Clinton's army in North Carolina, and now had more reinforcements coming from France and Holland and Spain at this point, and Great Britain is forced to evacuate because they can't keep up the war anymore with all of those nations now being involved. So, to summarize the whole thing, the American Revolution happened as a result of civil instability within Great Britain leading up to the American Revolution, and the mismanagement of the British government of the colonies by giving them full autonomy for 200 years before the Declaration of Independence, on top of the economic issues that Great Britain accrued locally, and the famine, as mentioned, along with the logistical errors of the generals that were appointed to end the war by the British, specifically William Howe, and the psychological elements of Great Britain not even fully recognizing the Patriot movement as being legitimate due to the demographic disparities of colonists that were loyalists and colonists that were patriots. So it had absolutely nothing to do with the end of the American Revolution, had nothing to do with any military movements by Washington, or even the collective consensus of patriots in the colonies because they were a minority to begin with, which is extremely interesting. And whenever we learn about American history, we're told a completely different story. Even in college, I never learned a lot of these things that I now know from this book. And I gotta say, I had to put the book down a little bit sometimes as I was reading it, and this is just all now personal things I'm going to share. And it's mainly because I was kind of conflicted with this new story that I know about the American Revolution, because we're told a very idealized version, which is that we stood up to Great Britain and we made our, our presence known in the world through conviction and our belief in these new philosophical thoughts. When really we're kind of only a country due to the fact that we were very lucky and that we were very self-sufficient for so long. And the darker side of this is that the Patriots weren't necessarily good people, and they weren't necessarily the common man. They really weren't. They were the people that were able to benefit from this system, who became wealthy and prospered. And it really wasn't until Samuel Adams got the common man on board through, his speeches and his acts that we even associated, or that anybody really associated from this time period, the Patriot movement with the common man or the average person. So it was kind of difficult for me to reconcile those things as I was reading this, because it's not the story we're told. We're told that it was a consensus in America, and it wasn't. And we're told that these were ideas that were so profound that the majority of people believed them, and that wasn't the case. And we're told that George Washington was an amazing general, and he wasn't. He made a lot of mistakes. His army turned on him so many times. Congress turned on him so many times. He was almost they almost took his leadership away until the Battle of Saratoga happened. And he had a lot of his own soldiers plot to kill him or sabotage him. There's even a battle in here where they talk about how one of his officers directly disobeyed an order and then was found out to be a spy. So it's very, very chaotic, and luck has a lot to do with why we actually are a country now. And our country's origins come from a political and social thought that was shared within Great Britain itself, which is why I think America has so many similarities to Great Britain's history and even Great Britain's, politics today, because we were involved in this war through proxy. It was a proxy civil war. The American Revolution is a proxy civil war. It's not a revolution that you can look at and draw too many other parallels to throughout history. You can take some things and kind of see, but It's very different from like Roman history, which is a lot of their civil wars were just due to one very tyrannical leader that could overpower another leader. It's not really like that. It's not even like the Spanish Civil War very much. I think it's closer to the Spanish Civil War in a lot of ways, but it's I think it actually more so mirrors the French Revolution, which is perhaps why a lot of the founders of the country, like Thomas Jefferson, talked very highly of the French Revolution. But anyways, very interesting book. Highly recommend. Kind of shattering my worldview, so to speak. So that's the end of that book. I have already started 2 other books, and I'm not sure which one I'm going to do a review on first after I get done reading it, in between my busy schedule with music and everything. But I've started the majority of this book so far. It's called The Wolf Age, and it's about the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons in Europe. In England. And the book starts from the time period of the 800s AD, and it goes into the decline of Viking society, and the struggles of the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, so that's the end of this video. So this is the book that I'm reading now. The other book I'm reading now is The History of Rome. I'm not sure which one I'm gonna finish first, but I'll do a review on that on either one of these soon, whenever I finish them. So thanks for watching. If you made it to the end, thank you.